Good evening. You're listening to the Midnight Manuscripts podcast, and I'm your host, Onyx Brightwing. If you enjoy this channel, please give us a like and subscribe. Tonight I have a story for you by Heddy Johannesen called Skin, in which a skeleton man has to find new skin because he's been cursed by the god Loki. The skeleton man gazed at his ghastly form. Jake's bone fingers grazed his lower exposed bones. The yellowed skin pulled away from the bones. Then gingerly, he stepped into the right leg of skin, then the left leg. He felt the skin clothe his bones. He examined it all to make sure everything was all right. He was accustomed to this sensation by now. He unlocked his closet with a unique gold key. A sight greeted his eyes that would horrify anyone else. The fluorescent bathroom light flickered overhead. Jake regarded his appearance. His upper body bore flesh, and now his lower body did. Jake removed a box from the closet, which he opened. His eyeballs and teeth rested next to each other. Jake pushed the hard round eyeballs into the eye sockets and snapped his teeth into his jaw. His throat was parched. He clacked his teeth to make sure they were in place. Jake cringed at the sight of his sunken eyes, hollow cheekbones, and gaunt, bony frame. He returned the box to the closet and locked it with the key. He shuddered, remembering his nightmare. Demonic rats gnawed on his bones and eyes, and his throat swelled. He writhed in agony during the nightmare. He yawned, stretched, and peered out the parted curtain to the window. The moonlight shone over the shadowy street. Relief coursed through him. Jake resisted the urge to scratch his legs. There couldn't be a single tear, snare, or snag. Yet, he managed to survive without a single cut for 25 years. Finally, Jake sighed in defeat and glanced down at the frayed skin of his lower torso skin. He would need new skin soon. Jake admired the bone tattoos on his fingers. His pointed black nails fidgeted with the zipper of the medicine bag. He opened a leather medicine bag. Jake removed the moisturizer, toothpaste, toothbrush, cologne, and aftershave. He smoothed the tinted moisturizer over his face, carefully blending evenly, and combed gel through his scraggy hair. Jake tucked his black shirt into his creased black trousers. He scowled as he returned the items to the medicine bag and shut it. Jake had nearly finished the moisturizer. He left the bathroom. Jake knelt and lit a candle at his altar. The candle cast a warm glow. He whispered a prayer to Odin and studied the gold skull on the wall above his altar. He lingered for a moment and contemplated silence. Then his gaze landed on the statue of Loki. He grimaced and tensed. He closed his eyes. Loki cursed him for existing between the worlds of the living and the dead. "You cursed me to exist like this. For how long?" he whispered and rose to his feet. The cold floor sent shivers up his leathery body. He wore his silver rings, skull pewter necklace, and a black top hat, adorned with a purple feather, and swung his cane decorated with the silver serpent through the air. Colorful leaves trickled to the cold earth. Carved pumpkins rested on porches and decks, their eerie grins permanently pasted on their orange faces. Jake's green cloak swished. He strutted out the door and tucked the unique gold key into his cloak pocket. He headed for the cemetery to work his shift. Gray smoke curled in the air from Jake's pipe. Robert stood outside a cafe reading The New Yorker and smiled when he recognized Jake. Jake examined Robert for a moment. Robert's dark blue suit was tailored, and his short dark hair was clipped close to his head. His cornflower blue eyes scrutinized everything he saw. Robert forever complained about the weather, news, and work. Jake regarded Robert with intense hatred. Being in his presence for 5 minutes made Jake want to scream. "Good evening, Jake," Robert said. He spoke with an affected British accent. Jake inclined his head in greeting. Robert coughed heavily. Jake narrowed his eyes and clenched his teeth. A dark giddiness overcame him. He adjusted his Gothic sunglasses and joined his side. "I'm dying here, on so many pills," Robert said. Robert coughed hard and bent over in pain. Blood appeared on the Kleenex. "The doctors said I don't have long to live." Jake helped Robert over to a nearby bench. Robert sat down on the bench. "How is Laura these days?" Jake asked him. "She's fine," he said, wheezing. "She works today at the cafe. In case you want to talk to her." Robert gestured to the cafe a few feet away. "I hope you feel better soon, Robert," Jake said, nodding his head in sympathy. Robert rose and strolled down the street, unaware that Jake was watching him. Jake walked to the cemetery to begin his shift. The quiet night called to Jake. Moonlight glowed over the cemetery when Jake arrived to begin his night shift. The hours crawled by. After Jake did his shift, Jake returned home and lay in bed. He dreamed about demonic rats, razor-sharp fangs gnawing on his body. He heard the pattering of their feet, their shrill, eerie squeaks. They nibbled on his head, blood spurted everywhere. Their sharp incisors were blood-stained. He awoke and shook all over. He slept to hide during the day from the sun's blazing eye. He couldn't remember when he was mortal. Jake sprang from the creaking bed and unlocked the closet. His bones ached from stiffness, and his pale, old yellowing skin itched. He smoothed his skin over his legs. He shuddered, knowing how long he could keep his existence a secret. Jake set his eyes in the twin sockets. The rubber texture of his eyes made him cringe. He clicked his jaw several times, dressed, locked the closet, and left. Jake spotted Laura seated on a bench. He approached her, and his left hand grasped his cane. He sat next to Laura. Tears stained her face. She smoked a cigarette and gulped some coffee. "Good evening, Laura," he said. He handed her a handkerchief. She dried her tears with it. The tight black dress she wore accentuated her curves. Her wavy brown hair hung down her back. "Got any plans for the evening?" Laura's voice cracked. She finished her coffee and took another hard drag of her cigarette. They left the park. "No," he said. "You look upset. You might feel better if you had someone to talk to." The expression on her face told him all he needed to know. He laid a hand on her shoulder. "I hope you'll be okay." Jake gazed deeply into her eyes. "Take it easy," Jake said. Jake shook his head and offered her his arm. She accepted it. "Do you want a coffee?" Laura asked, glancing over her shoulder a few times. Jake followed her gaze. She shivered from the cold. He shook his head. "No, thank you." "You live alone, don't you? No girlfriend or wife?" Jake shifted uncomfortably under Laura's gaze. Her presence irritated him. The timing was perfect. "You are odd. Something is mysterious about you." She smiled. "You wear cloaks. The color suits you." She stroked the rough wool texture. Jake flinched. Complete isolation left him unaccustomed to human touch. "Cloaks keep you warm," he said. The wind moaned through the trees. The streets grew quiet. "Would you like me to walk you home?" Jake asked, hoping she'd let him have his privacy. She laughed. "No, come on, seriously, where are you going tonight? Let's hang out all night." "Where is your boyfriend or husband?" he asked. "Oh, I don't have anyone." "You're lying," Jake said. She grinned. He steered the walk back to her home. They arrived. He looked at the front door and then back at her. "This is you, Laura." Jake hated to hurt her, but he needed to leave. Laura looked crushed. She reached the front door and then turned. "Are you coming in or what?" she said. Jake found himself following her in, ignoring the warning voice in his head and the itch of his skin. The warmth washed over him. The gorgeous dark blue carpeting, the plush love seat, and the red velvet curtains took him by surprise. He spent so much time in his rundown tenement that he squirmed uncomfortably for a second. He sat back on the love seat, taken aback. "Would you like some wine?" He accepted the glass of red wine from her. The wine coursed down his parched throat. He relaxed and smiled. "You have a nice place," he said. Laura sat next to Jake. He felt her breath on his face. He drew back as if he was stung. "Thank you." "What's wrong?" Laura peered deep into his eyes. Her hand caressed his knee. Jake relaxed despite his inner tension and stroked her hair. They kissed. He embraced her. She moaned as they sank back on the couch. He tingled from the feel of her body beneath his, her hair's texture and her skin's scent. He felt alive. He pulled away, finished the glass of wine, and stood. Laura jumped to her feet. "I'm sorry, I have to get going," Jake said, and headed straight for the door. He sighed and glanced at her. She wore an angry look on her face. "You are such a jerk. Why are you so evasive?" she snapped and walked Jake to the door. "Why are you so curious?" Their gaze held for long moments. "Where are you going?" He sighed harshly. "There's something about you. I want to know what it is." She faced him, her hands planted on her hips. Jake tensed, unsure of what to do. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said and peered out the window. "Good night, Laura." He left. The cold air hit him like 1,000 knives. The crimson sun sank below the city skyline. Costumed children ran down the street, their Halloween bags laden with candy. "Hey, Jake, wait up!" Laura cried out to him. He pretended not to hear her. "Laura, why are you following me?" He turned. I don't want to be followed and stalked again by the drug dealer. I owe him money." "Hey, fine. I'll talk to you later." Laura marched back to her apartment. Jake took shelter under a large oak tree. He remained there for almost an hour and watched everything that moved. When he was sure no one went near her apartment door, he finally left. Jake collapsed under the threadbare couch at home and grimaced at the dusty wall-to-wall carpeting. Tattered white curtains swayed like ghosts. Jake breathed in musty apartment air. He wondered how it felt to hold Laura in his arms. He'd felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He hated the pervasive silence. He swallowed to moisten his parched throat and yearned for more wine, but there was none. Jake recalled the texture of the plush love seat and the scent of her hair. Anger surged within him. He forced himself to think about something else. Robert's coffin rested in the deep, dark ground. One thought burned in Jake's mind. No one must ever know. The energy of the night filled him. A cold smile crossed his face. A strange giddiness overcame him. Jake glanced out the window. Shadows landed on the street. People milled around and seemed to take no notice of him. He double-checked the locks on his doors, closed the window, and then locked it. Then he peeked out the window again. Nothing. His pulse sped. Old newspapers buried Jake's dagger. He toyed with the double-sided blade. The Gothic sword was decorated with the silver inlay over a black handle. It gave Jake a unique medieval feel when he held it in his hands. His problems would all be solved. Soon. He quivered at the prospect ahead of him. Jake left his apartment and headed for the cemetery. Cars lined the quiet streets and dry leaves skittered over the ground. He glanced over his shoulder several times as he strode down the dingy street, preferring to take the longer route to avoid detection. It seemed to take forever, but the blood moon glowed over the cemetery. Shadows fell on the gnarled trees and headstones. He let himself into the locked cemetery with a key. The security guards had finished their shifts long ago. He glanced around to see if anyone was watching him. Jake basked in the quiet darkness and glanced around the cemetery. He passed the rows of graves carrying a shovel and a large black plastic garbage bag. Finally, Jake arrived at Robert's grave. He prayed he would not get caught. A crow landed on a headstone cawing. Jake nearly dropped the dagger in his fear. He ignored the crow and began digging and quivered with excitement. His bones ached with anticipation. Jake shoveled the earth from Robert's grave until he heard a heavy thud, stepped into the grave, and removed the coffin lid with effort. There lay the fresh corpse. He drooled over it. He tore the clothing apart to reveal the flesh with his dagger. A corpse decomposes within a week. Robert's corpse was fresh. Jake traced the edge of the coffin lid with his free hand. He frowned as he noticed they didn't use a sealer casket. The corpse would not have been kept dry enough to meet Jake's needs. Jake's shaking hand gripped the dagger. He needed his hand to perform the ritual and cursed in anger aloud. Jake continued cutting the cold, dead flesh. He needed to cut the entire lower skin of the man in one perfect piece, so Jake couldn't jerk his hand. Not one twitch, not one error. He carved the skin of the feet from the corpse, and his other hand grasped the limp, blood-soaked flesh. Jake returned the clothing to the corpse and shut the lid. He withdrew the large black garbage bag he stored under his cloak and lowered the skin into it. Then Jake put the clothing back on the corpse and put the coffin lid back into place. He shoveled the dirt back into the grave. Jake needed to clean the blood off himself. Jake entered the washroom for the security guards. He washed the blood off of his face and hands, then left. When Jake entered the cemetery, police sirens wailed in the distance. He prayed they never found him and kept his head down as he returned home. Jake tucked the plastic garbage bag under his cloak. People passed him, their eyes questioning as he lugged the load to his apartment door. Once inside, he deposited the bag into the coat closet. The next evening, Laura knocked on Jake's door. He ignored her as long as he could. Then he let her in. Laura sat down on the couch. "How was work?" he asked, trying to sound casual. He caught Laura staring at the dingy cloak hanging over the back of a chair. He heard a dog barking outside, and then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He stared at her and then peeked out the curtains. She sat up straight on the couch. She never took her eyes off him. "When I kissed you, I felt something strange." "The kiss?" He stared at her blankly. "Oh, yes." He remembered it a second later. "Yes. When I kissed you, it was like kissing someone drunk, or worse." Her voice sounded small. She rubbed her hands on her pants. "I had no choice. I had to come here to see you." Jake gazed at her. He sensed the pounding of her heart, but he couldn't take the chance. She flinched from his expression. He steered her to the door, but she resisted him. Laura's hand covered her heart. She looked worried. "I want to know what it is you do." A heavy silence fell between them. Laura moistened her throat, grabbed her purse, and regarded him for a moment. Then finally, she wiped away some tears and shouldered her bag. "I've done something wrong, haven't I?" "Fine, I'm leaving." She pulled on her coat and left. Jake stood and thought and remembered the skin. Jake locked the front door, grabbed the bag from the closet, and re-entered the living room. Jake needed to prepare the skin. Jake removed the skin from the garbage bag and mopped up the blood. The skin dried on old newspaper on the floor. He inspected every inch for cuts or tears. It seemed to be perfect. Jake let the skin to dry there for hours. Then he lay down on the couch, something he hadn't done in a long time. Sunlight streamed into the room. Hours later, Jake awoke and examined the skin. He stepped into each leg over his entire lower body. Jake held his breath. At last, the fresh human skin fit. Jake glanced at the magical sigil on the wall above his altar. Jake held his hand over his heart. Death pants were a tradition of Scandinavian ancestors, Nibrock. The death pants. He closed his eyes, then opened them and admired his new skin. Snakes shed their skins to grow new ones. The thread of life, death, and rebirth had occurred since the dawn. Jake donned his clothing and top hat. He swung the cane as he strode down the street. An autumnal chill lingered in the air. As he passed down the road, he basked in the sensation of his skin. Laura approached him from the cafe where she worked, a hot coffee in her hand. Uh-oh. Hi, Jake. The police questioned me, Jake, Laura said. She looked worried. He froze. What did you tell them? Well, Hey, Jake gripped her hard. Laura didn't like the expression on his face as she marched into the cafe. He followed her and spun her around. She gasped. He shook her harder. What did you tell them? Her eyes widened in fear as Jake let go of her. Laura glanced around the cafe. He narrowed his eyes. People stared in their direction. Jake's mind raced. He panted hard. Jake, what's wrong? She handed a customer a fresh cup of coffee. Jake gripped his cane so hard his knuckles turned white. He steered her to a quieter section of the cafe. What did you tell them? He broke out in a sweat. She looked taken aback. Your home, your life? I have a gut feeling you've done something. Never mind, just tell me. I told them that you live alone. You're a little odd. Well, it's true. Your skin is an unusual color. Your kiss, it's like you were dead or something, which is impossible. Oh my God, what are you? That's why you pulled away from me. She realized she was yelling and glanced around the cafe. She coughed to clear her throat. She drew back in shock. Laura, please, I don't want to harm you. I can't have you doing this, okay? Please understand, I mean you no harm. Oh, you drive me mad. He glowered at her darkly. He wondered how much she had told the police and what would happen to him. Laura didn't realize how much she threatened everything he'd guarded. He struggled to remain calm. He needed to leave, now. He kept his back to her as he thought of what to do. Everything will be all right? She got to the point from the expression on his face and walked away to tend to her customers. No, it won't be all right, Laura. Apprehension gripped him. He shrugged his cloak around and pushed his top hat over his face. If the police came snooping, he didn't want to be recognized. The sky darkened over the city skyline. He took a different route home to avoid Laura and the police. Jake headed for the cemetery to check to see if everything looked normal. The autumn leaves blew in the harsh gale, and his cloak swished around his body. To Jake's alarm, police and security guards gathered around Robert's grave. He turned to leave when one of them ran over to where Jake stood. Hey, were you aware that something happened here earlier? The policeman said. He gulped. No, I was not. Are you aware a grave was disturbed here the other night? Someone told us they saw someone here matching your description digging up a grave. You do realize that is illegal. He gave Jake a stern look. No, I wasn't aware, officer, Jake said. Well, I just want to be sure. Or it could have been a prank pulled by crazy kids. It's Halloween after all. Of course, I understand. Jake kept the tone of his voice even and met his unwavering gaze. As Jake began to work his night shift, he glanced over a few times nervously. When Jake finally finished his shift, his bones quivered with fear. He hid in the sheltering darkness of a cluttered alley. Jake lost track of time. He hurried home as the sun rose over the sleepy city. Jake hung his top hat on the coat rack. His cane clattered to the floor, and he tossed the cloak onto the threadbare sofa. Finally, Jake crawled out of his skin. He was about to remove his teeth and eyes from the closet when he heard a knock at the door. He froze and cursed out loud. Donning his skin, teeth, and eyes seemed to take an eternity. Then finally, he wore his robe, smoothed his hair, and crept to the door. He cursed in anger again. He blocked the door to keep Laura from entering. Laura was pale and shaken as she pushed past him into his apartment. Jake shut the door behind her. What did you do to Robert? What did you do to my father? She screamed. He must have appeared ghastly to her. She gaped at Jake, horrified. Jake stared at her. She hurried into the living room, her eyes taking in every detail. He followed. I can't have you telling the truth to the police, Laura. I lead a quiet, secretive life. I don't know what you have told them. Tell me. What is wrong? She gasped and backed away from him. I told you what I told them. I don't understand. Laura's gaze swept over his skeletal frame and skin, and her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened with fear as she collapsed to the floor. Are you dead or alive? She stammered. She backed away from Jake and stared in horror. Jake peered harder at Laura. Her head went back and she closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. He realized she had overdosed. He thought of what to do. His brain burned from the anger surging within him. A vein pulsed in his head. The demonic rats from his nightmares gnawed at his brain with their razor-sharp incisors. He let out a tormented scream and held his head in his hands. He pushed the dark thoughts to the back of his mind, breathed haggardly, and tried to think clearly. Laura's head fell back, and she fell unconscious. Jake laid her down on the couch and put his cloak over her. He stroked her hair, then noticed the needle marks on her arm. She remained semi-conscious. He realized she was passed out from the drugs. Laura drew back in pain and then struggled to her feet. Jack stared at her in shock. Jack cradled Laura's lifeless body in his arms. Her eyes fluttered as she lay dying in his arms. Jake peered at her, listening to her breathing, then glanced at the altar. He knelt at the altar. "Loki, please," he said, and coughed to clear his throat. "Why do you curse me with the existence? To what purpose? Let me share eternity with her." Jake waited. It seemed to take an eternity. Finally, Laura gasped, and he whipped around and helped her to her feet. She screamed. Jake cupped his hand over her mouth. He removed his robe and stood there with a stricken expression. Jake extended his hand, but Laura drew back from him in fear. A heavy silence fell between them. Laura stepped over to the mirror. Her trembling hands flew to her face as she stared at herself, and a realization dawned on her. Jake dressed, smiled, and embraced her. She found herself relaxing in his arms. Jake swung his cane, donned his top hat, and extended his hand to Laura's bony hand. They stepped out into the moonlit night. The end. I hope you've enjoyed what you've heard. This is Onyx Brightwing signing off from the Midnight Manuscripts. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Have a good evening.